Neoconservatives and the new American century. There's kind of three interrelated questions that we wish to explore. First of all, what is a neoconservative relative to a traditional conservative? What were these neoconservatives? What was their worldview? How did the Bush administration hijack 9/11 to put through its preconceived plan, the plan for the new American century? And why did the plan for the new American century put such a big emphasis on invading Iraq, despite the lack of a tangible connection between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein? So, who were the neoconservatives? And I guess you can answer that kind of in two ways. Who were they as a sociological group, and what was their ideology? In terms of coherent ideology, neoconservatives, or most neoconservatives, start off as kind of neoliberals. They believed in kind of nation building. They believed in using American power for good. After the kind of the end of the Cold War, they kind of turned into neoconservatives because they put a lot more emphasis on using American military power as a conduit for essentially spreading democracy and market capitalism to make the world more secure and prosperous. In particular, the neoconservatives were really hung up on Vietnam. They believed that Vietnam had made the Americans gun shy and unwilling to use its power for good. And they looked down at the Clinton administration in particular as being weak, eroding American defenses and not using its influence in the world. Now, if we try to think about neoconservatives as a sociological group, this cast of individuals that we're going to encounter in our kind of 2-decade story, we first kind of meet them in the first Bush administration. Herbert Walker Bush had followed into the footsteps of Ronald Reagan. He'd been his vice president. He had been involved with Gorbachev and orchestrating the end of the Cold War and kind of guiding the collapse of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. So Dick Cheney was none less than the defense secretary of the first Bush. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously Americans were very triumphal. They had won the Cold War, and now came the time to establish the peace. And as defense secretary, what Dick Cheney really began was trying to reimagine American military power, where there essentially was no Soviet Union. And he really began the business of reimagining, what is the type of capabilities that the American military is going to need in the 21st century. And basically he wrote this white paper called Defense Planning Guidance, which was kind of the first draft of reimagining American military power in a post-Cold War world. After the successful Gulf War, he very much anticipated that Bush would get a second term, and he would move from the white paper to actually putting his plan into place. But the neoconservative plan was essentially interrupted by this philandering governor from Arkansas, who was a gifted politician and was able to talk to Americans. Very different from the President Bush, who struggled to operate a credit card at a grocery store, seemed very out of touch. So, despite Clinton's personal and moral failings, he won an election against Bush, with the result that the neoconservatives, who had anticipated, establishing the United States in this post-Cold War world, were all suddenly unemployed. And not only were they unemployed, but they were horrified that Bill Clinton would squander this historic opportunity to leverage American power, and instead acknowledging that the Soviet Union was no longer a threat, began the process of reducing American military spending and using some of the savings for social programs and social problems. Now, not only did Clinton squander this opportunity, but then he was reelected despite all the shenanigans going on in the White House. So, what were these unemployed neoconservatives to do? Well, what they often do is they found jobs in these think tanks. One of those think tanks was called Project for New American Century. And essentially what these heavyweight neoconservatives were doing was arguing what they would have done if they had been in power, or what the Clinton administration should have done, which was this radical plan to invest in American military power in order to extend it across the world as a stabilizing force. This is what the New American Century meant. It was essentially an analogy to Rome and the Pax Romana. The Rome was so powerful that it created stability across the Mediterranean. Now, this was a unipolar moment where the United States had no equal, and it was now able to tackle rogue states and promote democracy and open markets across the world for the benefit of everyone else. This would inaugurate a century of stability and prosperity. That was their thinking. So, to the extent that we can, identify, coherent tenets of the neoconservative ideology, I think the one they all shared was overcoming what was called the Vietnam Syndrome. The reluctance of the United States to use military power because they were afraid of getting stuck into another quagmire. They were also generally critics of liberal nation building. They believed that the military should be used for a military purpose, and you couldn't build, democracies, or, like in Vietnam, you couldn't stabilize these things. So the Clinton administration of intervening in places like Somalia, troops were taught to fight. They were not civil affairs officers. This would get American troops involved in missions that they couldn't complete in places like Haiti, where there was no prospect of success. The military is for national defense. It should be used for a military purpose only. Another thing that really united neoconservatives was the idea of the end of the Cold War, so that this was a historic opportunity in which the United States had an ability to essentially establish a century of stability if it was wise about the choices that it's made. The neoconservatives also tended to view American military power as a positive force, a positive stabilizing force for global change. It maybe wasn't well suited for nation building, but it was an effective tool for dealing with rogue states like Syria that were essentially making life miserable for American allies like Israel, giving money to terrorists, and destabilizing their neighbors. If you could uproot these rogue states and create democracies there, it would stabilize the region. The Americans had the ability to do this. We had this massive arsenal. We should use this power to stabilize the world, and everyone will be better off, including the people that are being trapped by people like Kim Jong-un or Assad. They also argued, somewhat fancifully, that this power to overthrow these rogue leaders would enable democracies to emerge in these darker corners of the world, especially with the Soviet Union retreating. And their larger strategic goal, which is a little bit implicit, they don't use China by name, but they use a lot of euphemisms, is the idea that with the Soviet Union gone, the Americans were supreme, a hyperpower across the world. But the problem was there was a void that was left. The void could become unstable, like Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, when the Soviet Union retreated. But it was also a void that potentially another power could fill and supplant the Soviet Union. And this would create, again, another Cold War. And that's not what you wanted. You wanted to preempt another power from coming in and taking the Soviet Union's place and creating this bipolarity. And of course, the only power that could logically do this was China, because it was growing very quickly in the 1990s through economic reforms, and there were some projections already in 1990 that China could, by the middle of the 21st century, overtake the United States. So China, if they could build their economy, they could build their military, they could replace the Soviet Union. And the idea is, we got to prevent that from happening. And the way we prevent that from happening is we invest in next generation technology so that we're so powerful that China will just give up, have no opportunity to challenge us, because if they do, we'll just kind of knock them into place. So one of the things that historians do is they look at primary source documents, and by looking at these various documents in time and tracing the lineage of these ideas, what we can see is that these neoconservative principles are kind of forming in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Their first real articulation is Dick Cheney as Defense Secretary and Defense Planning Guidance. Then we can see these ideas being kind of revarnished, developed relative to a new context in the think tank, the Project for the New American Century. So in 1997, they create this document called Rebuilding American Defenses. It's essentially the same plan, but it's updating it in various ways with the conditions that prevail now. And then in 2000, when Bush wins the election, all these neocons that have been unemployed for 8 years, now they become the prime movers in the Bush administration. And one of the things that they realize is that after 8 years of peace, it's really not possible to convince the Americans to start to invest in next generation military technology, go into this massive military spending to fight the Soviet Union that's in complete collapse. But 9/11 provides an opportunity for them to bring the new American century ideas out of hiding. They call it kind of the Pearl Harbor moment was their fanciful language for it. And what they essentially do is, after 9/11, just a couple of weeks later, is this Rebuilding American Defense document, which they already have, now becomes, appears out of nowhere. All of a sudden it becomes the U.S. grand strategy, the Bush Doctrine, essentially. And they follow it. They follow this plan to attack one of the members of the Axis of Evil, Iraq. And Iraq was only the first and the weakest of the Axis of Evil. One of the things that Paul Wolfson always said is that the real men want to go from Baghdad to Tehran. The idea was, we're going to go into Iraq, we're going to overthrow the regime, 3 months will be out, and then we'll redeploy to Iran, we'll get rid of that regime, and I guess then they were going to move on to North Korea. But they never happened because they got stuck in the quagmire of Iraq, ironically, because they ignored the lessons of Vietnam. So if we look at the Rebuilding American Defenses document, again, it's about 300 pages, and there's lots of stuff, and they're not always clear about everything. Like when they're talking about strategic resources, they're really talking about oil, and and they don't really mention China by name, but it's clear that's what they're talking about. So I'm just going to give you kind of a broad summary of this document. The basic thing is, again, it's in the title. A New American Century is that American military force was an instrument for good. It was going to be able to overthrow rogue regimes, and by doing that, it would stabilize the world and provide the foundation for a century of the American dominance. It would be American dominance, but they justified this because American dominance would stabilize the world. It would promote democracy, freedom, market capitalism, and everyone would benefit from this. Supposedly, maybe some people in Iraq wouldn't benefit from it, but the idea was that the theory was everyone would benefit from it. There's a lot of talk about establishing strategic bases all around the world. This is part of the idea of not just having an army that can fight the Soviet Union and stop a Soviet attack in the Fulda Gap from overrunning Western Europe, but having the ability to project forces across the globe and be able to sustain what they called multiple theater wars. In other words, you'd be able to fight North Korea and deal with a crisis in Haiti and Ghana at the same time. So you didn't need a lot of main battle tanks. What you needed to have was a much more mobile, rapid deployment force and be able to sustain multiple theater wars. In other words, insurgencies in different parts of the globe. You had to have more special forces, high technology, aircraft, to fight essentially scenarios that you were likely to encounter in the 21st century. Now, another strategic goal is almost the exact opposite of that, but you need to prevent someone from filling Russia's void, and China is the real threat here. And their idea is, if we invest in next generation technologies, we'll be like 3 generations ahead. China, they don't even, like in 1991, they barely had an air force, right? And they didn't have a major armored force. Their technology very backward, but they had a lot of economic potential. They're growing 10% a year, and they're gaining a lot of technology. So you have to prevent China from becoming a superpower. How do you do that? Well, they actually had this kind of antiquated idea, which is interesting because Dick Cheney had worked at Halliburton, but they believe that the control of oil is, whoever controls oil controls the world. It's almost like Dune, right? So they thought that, they're being kicked out of Saudi Arabia. If we can get a base in Iraq, we can control the oil fields of the Middle East and all the reserves, so we can control the price of oil. And we can, basically throttle that up and down, and we can decide whether, China gets the oil or what price they pay. We basically can give this strategic resource to our friends or allies and deny it to our enemies. So this would be one way that we could check China's power. The other was to invest in, next generation, weapons platforms, including putting weapons into space. So this was the basic plan, and basically that's what they started to do after 9/11. Now, one of the reasons I argue that the American brain trust, the Bush administration, neglected the Al-Qaeda file is because they did have such a sophisticated plan and vision, and they were busy implementing, and they didn't want to be distracted by this, which they didn't consider a real threat. So even before the 9/11 attack, we can see the Americans putting into place elements of the plan for the new American century. One famous example is the oil notes, where Cheney is supposedly having an energy conference where the energy department is not invited. He's meeting with all his colleagues from the oil companies, and what we find out later is, they're basically dividing, Iraq's oil fields between them. So they already had, they're making a provisional plan for attacking Saddam and invading the country, doing regime change and taking over the country. But it was too hard to justify, an invasion of Iraq or military spending in the context of 2001. It was really 9/11 that changed everything. In fact, Dick Cheney is on his way to the Pentagon when it struck, and I don't think he actually saw the plane explode, but he arrives there very soon after the attack, and he actually pulls a guy out of the building, the smoldering Pentagon. And it kind of strikes him when he's there. This is a golden opportunity. What we talked about before. That here is the Pearl Harbor moment. Let's use this to put through the project for the new American century that Americans normally wouldn't support. So what we see is that barely a week after 9/11. The project for New American Century now becomes the security strategy of the United States. Is now justified as a strategy to deal with terrorists, when in fact it's not. It's about dealing with China and American hegemony and everything else. But the fear of terrorism, which they in part cultivate themselves, becomes the excuse and the rationale for Americans not paying too much attention and making these radical changes to foreign policy that they need to implement their plan for expanding American military power. So this also explains why they let bin Laden escape. They had him surrounded in Tora Bora in November 2001. They could have easily brought the troops in and captured him, but they really weren't concerned about it. They would have captured him if they could have captured him. They had 50, I think, Delta forces around. They could have brought in massive amount of forces to surround him, but they were redeploying to Iraq. They weren't concerned about al-Qaeda, even to the end. It was Obama that eventually hunted down bin Laden in Pakistan. Now, in order to justify the new American century, even in the wake of 9/11, they had to amplify the threat. So you can see that there's this steady cast of Bush-era officials that come to the news shows and they keep beating the refrain. They essentially try to morph bin Laden and al-Qaeda into Saddam Hussein in Iraq to justify taking out Saddam Hussein, because otherwise nuclear weapons are going to end up over American cities. And they have absolutely no evidence to back this up. I won't go into all the details of how they stovepiped this information and misled the public. It's all pretty well known, and the story's not that interesting, but it largely succeeded. One of their big failures is that Colin Powell convinced them to go to the UN. And Colin Powell brought out these satellite images, and people looked at that a little bit skeptical. Canada, for example, Jean Chrétien was like, "I'm not going in unless you can prove that there's actually weapons of mass destruction." And Saddam kind of surprised them because he allowed the UN weapon inspectors in, and they were given everything, even to his private bunkers, and they found nothing. So this meant they were kind of caught. They'd gone to the UN, believing that Saddam would deny weapons inspectors, so then they had the rationale to rally the UN to invade Iraq. But in fact, he called their bluff, allowed the inspectors to come in. They found nothing. And as a result, the UN couldn't support it. Canada didn't support it, and they had to put together the coalition of the willing, which was Britain and a few minor contingents from Europe and Central America, essentially. In the run-up to the Iraq War, even before they'd gone to the UN, they're already ramping up. They're deploying troops. I mean, it takes years to deploy this amount of military power to Iraq. They're also making plans to basically siphon off Iraq's oil. So they're making all these deals with private businesses and military contractors. They're playing the UN game, but they were already committed to go in. And when they don't get the UN vote of confidence, they go in anyway. So there you go. Now, the coalition of the willing makes short work of Saddam Hussein's army. And you have to understand that Saddam Hussein's army had already been defeated in the first Gulf War, never really recovered from that. His regime had been under sanctions. In the second encounter of American troops, they don't try to fight them on the battlefield. Essentially, they decide to fight a guerrilla war. So the result is the American troops do a blitzkrieg. They rapidly take control of the country, but it's not the control of territory that matters. One of the things that happens right away is that the country is very unstable. It's been living under sanctions. There's a lot of rivalries between Shia and Sunni, Kurds as well. So it's a very chaotic situation. The Americans are not there to establish order. They're there to get rid of Saddam and basically divide up the oil between private American companies. So as they take over, they don't maintain law and order, and there's all this violence that spills out, a lot of robbing and score settling that's happening. And there's also the beginning of a resistance against the American occupation. It's very clear to the Iraqis that the Americans are not just getting rid of Saddam Hussein, supposedly liberators to provide democracy. They're there to colonize Iraq and to control its oil. They're building the largest embassy in the world in Baghdad, and they're building these massive bases. They're building a permanent military base in Iraq, and this isn't lost on the locals. Another major problem that they run into is the American occupation authority makes many political mistakes. Their biggest political mistake is basically saying that the Baathists, which are largely Sunni but not all Sunni, who had supported the Saddam regime and who had been dependent on it, are banned from power. So the old elite are pushed out. So they are forced into the hands of the resistance, and they launch essentially an insurgency against the American troops. Now, the Americans control the territory, but they don't have enough forces to really provide security or control it. So these officers that didn't fight the Americans in the field have gone back to civilian uniform. They've stashed their weapons, and they begin IED attacks on American troops and installations. This is the beginning of the insurgency that essentially the Bush administration tries to deny even exists. But it becomes apparent that more and more American troops are dying. They're not dying from the actual invasion itself, but from the occupation and resistance to the American occupation of their country and their control of their natural resources. So the American plan to, knock out Saddam Hussein, rebuild the economy, and get out is immediately thrown off. In order to extract their troops, they try to hold elections. But what happens when you hold an election in essentially a failed state, a state in which three main groups hate each other, have been pushed against each other, or want to have an independent future? It just confirms these sectarian divisions, exactly what happened. In fact, the Sunni, which is the former security officers, the intelligence, the army, they fight a dogged resistance. The Americans, the bloodiest battle of Iraq is many months after Saddam's capture, the Battle of Fallujah, where they basically have to fight house to house to reestablish their control over these Sunni tribal areas. The other thing that happens, and this is a little bit ironic, is that the American invasion of Iraq really strengthens the jihadist cause. So people like Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, their arguments that Americans are hostile to Muslims, slaughtering Iraqi civilians, make a lot of sense. And there's this new organization that was formed called al-Qaeda in Iraq. And al-Qaeda in Iraq didn't exist before the Americans came into Iraq. It's led by this man called al-Zarqi, who was a Syrian, kind of a jihadi type. He swears allegiance to Osama bin Laden, but it's mostly Saudis that are so angry about the amount of civilians that the Americans have killed in Iraq that they see Iraq as, like Afghanistan, as a jihad, a holy cause. And they're willing to join al-Qaeda and attack American troops in Iraq. It's much easier to do it there than it is in Saudi Arabia or the United States. And al-Zarqawi has got this very devilish idea that if we want to kick the Americans in the face, the way we do this is we'll do suicide attacks against Shia. Because if we attack the Shia, it's going to create a civil war. It will destabilize the country. The Americans will be here forever, easy targets for our IED bombs. So in a sense, the occupation of Iraq quickly generates into a civil war between the various groups, and the Americans are left there trying to maintain order. Like Vietnam, they're stuck in a quagmire. They can't get out. They can't pacify the country. They don't have enough troops. They're basically stuck there, and they're intensifying the jihadi cause, and they're making al-Qaeda in Iraq appear and making it a fearsome organization. What are you going to do? So ultimately, the Americans are able to extricate themselves from Iraq by doing a surge. In other words, bringing in enough troops that they can actually secure the country and start to uproot al-Qaeda in Iraq. One of the things they do, first of all, is that the Shia president creates a deal with Sunnis that they can be part of the government. He doesn't quite honor it, but he does make the deal in 2006. This enables the Sunni sheikhs, who are not Islamists, to join the Americans and attack al-Qaeda, which has also infiltrated them and taken over their society. So in other words, the former Ba'athists who had been allied with Saddam Hussein create an alliance with the Americans and the Shia to collectively take on al-Qaeda in Iraq. They trap Zarqawi, they kill him, and by 2009, al-Qaeda is essentially eliminated and the country is more or less stable. And this enables Obama to pull American troops out of Iraq, much to the chagrin, by the way, of the neoconservatives. They're like, why we spent $3 trillion and all these American lives for the oil, and you're going to just get out of there and just essentially allow Iraq to maintain their own oil? The horror of it. I mean, don't you understand what we were doing? So in 2008, after Bush's second term, the neocons are essentially forced from power. Obama is elected for various reasons, but one of the things is certainly his change of course. He had critiqued Bush on many points, including the war on terrorism. He had criticized the Guantanamo Bay, he had criticized the torture, he had criticized the Iraq War. He promised to bring America back to the side of justice, close Guantanamo, and get the American troops out of Iraq. And in 2008, quite soon after he's in power, he begins the process of bringing the American troops home. And both for that and of course his change of language, he's given the Peace Prize. But it's pretty interesting. You can kind of see he's embarrassed when he gets the Peace Prize. He's really given the Peace Prize not for his actual peaceful programs, but because of his renunciation of unilateralism of the Bush regime. In many ways, he carries on the Bush era policies, and in many ways, he even escalates the war in Afghanistan. He tries to create a surge in Afghanistan to stabilize it so he can pull American troops out. So he's kind of nervous. You can see in 2011 he gets a Nobel Peace Prize. He doesn't really think he's deserving. He's really not deserving, but he does in 2012 get the last American troops out of Iraq, much to the chagrin of John McCain and most of the conservatives. Now, this seems to be kind of the end of this, kind of sorry chapter of American involvement in the Middle East. By the time that American troops, the last American troops, kind of leave Iraq in 2012, Al-Qaeda is pretty much gone. There's about less than a couple dozen maybe jihadis that survived the counterinsurgency in Iraq, and they fled to Syria. And they were able to flee to Syria because the Arab Spring has began to spread through the Middle East. There's revolutions against autocracy in Egypt, Tunisia, many other areas as well. It also spills into Syria, where the Alawi are kind of a small sect that dominate the Sunni majority. They don't have much voice in the government. So the Arab Spring, this originally democratic movement, leads to a civil war in Syria, and essentially the failure of the state. And in these crevices, again, Al-Qaeda is given new life. It is able to establish its presence there outside. The Syria state no longer has control over its territory. The Al-Qaeda types, third generation kind of ally with the Sunnis to fight the Alawi regime, and also the Kurds, which are allied with the Americans. So it's all very complicated. Iran gets involved as well. The Syrian civil war is, of course, a disaster. There's over 3 million refugees. Most of them are internal, but many of them flee the country as well. And in this disaster, Al-Qaeda can surface again, and eventually they're going to form an Islamic state. In a way, they're going to carry out what Osama bin Laden had promised to do, but never quite did. Maybe the Taliban in Afghanistan would qualify as an Islamic state. But ISIL, which is essentially third, fourth generation Al-Qaeda, in the crevices of Syria and Iraq, is able to establish an Islamic state, call jihadis from around the world, and also send out terrorists to attack Western interests. So in this, bizarre turn of, fighting jihadi threats and projecting American power, we again see this bizarre intersection where brutal use of American power has, in a way, created the jihadi threat that the war of terrorism was supposed to prevent. But of course, the war on terrorism was never about fighting terrorists. It was always about projecting American military power to contain China. So to conclude, the neoconservatives viewed the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 as a great strategic opportunity. This is an opportunity to expand American military power and stabilize the world, to provide a foundation for an American century. The key to this was amplifying, accelerating investment in next-generation weapon platforms, establishing forward bases, including one in Iraq. This would prevent China from supplanting the Soviet Union and launching a new Cold War. Now, after 9/11, the neocons took the plan for the new American century and put it into place. And of course, one of the first things that was identified in rebuilding America's defenses was the strategic opportunity of removing Saddam Hussein and putting American troops in Iraq to control the oil fields. The problem is that, yes, overthrowing Saddam was one thing, occupying the country and basically stealing its oil was another. So the Americans, by really ignoring the lessons of Vietnam and ignoring experts of Iraq, they became trapped in a quagmire in Iraq, fighting, first the Baathists, then eventually creating Al-Qaeda in Iraq and fighting them, losing a lot of men and treasure, and this hopeless civil war, really caught in this quagmire until eventually the surge enables Obama to pull the American troops out.